The following is a conversation between Rip Rapson, the president and CEO of Kresge Foundation, and Denver Frederick, host of The Business of Giving, on AM 970 The Answer in New York City.
Transformation of any institution is difficult, particularly one as venerable and respected as the Kresge Foundation. Therefore, it's hard to imagine a more dramatic shift in strategy and direction that has occurred since my first guest assumed the helm there some 10 years ago. He is Rip Rapson, the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation. Good evening, Rip, and welcome to The Business of Giving.
Thank you, Denver. It's a pleasure.
You know, I'm sure some of our older listeners remember quite well the SS Kresge department stores. I know that I do. So before we get into the work of the foundation, tell us about Kresge stores and how this whole thing got started.
Well, SS Kresge had a simple idea way back at the turn of the century, and that was to provide what we would now call sort of a drugstore format to move goods and to get people to a luncheon counter. And over the next 20 or 25 years, he sort of slowly chipped away at this, started in the Midwest, sort of began to sort of spread throughout the country. And by 1924, the Kresge Five and Dime had become synonymous with sort of small-town retail, small-town social activity, and it was where everyone went to get their cherry Coke. And over the next 50 years, it grew, and ultimately transformed itself into Kmart. And in the early 60s, it's hard to remember, but in the early 60s, Kmart was really giving Walmart a run for its money.
Oh, that's for sure.
Yeah, and Sam Walton often has been said that they felt that they were just within a couple of business cycles of being essentially put out of business by Kmart. Little hard to imagine today, but true. But it got big enough and it got successful enough that the family and SS's Sebastian's son basically made the decision that they would get out of the business. They would sell their interest in Kmart, grab the money, put it in a trust, and create a foundation. And so that's how the Kresge Foundation was born in the late 60s, early 70s.
Great background. Well, moving to the foundation, if I look at some of my professional scar tissue, much of it was earned early in my nonprofit professional career doing Kresge Challenge grants. And if I may dare say, it was truly a painful process. And this is pretty much the organization that you walked into when you took the reins of Kresge back in 2006. Tell us about that process, challenge grants, and how they worked.
Well, 20 or 25 years ago, the Kresge leadership team came up with the idea that not only should they support building campaigns, which they had been doing for the better part of a half a century. It's really some of the first giving that Sebastian had done in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. But it was really sort of checkbook philanthropy. But in the early 60s and 70s, it struck them that if they could actually use their money through greater leverage, if they could say to a building campaign, we will give you a chunk of money so that by the time you get your lead gifts in, by the time you get all your corporate gifts in, and you really have to turn to your individual donors, we're going to give you an incentive package, essentially, to get those donors online in the hopes that over the long term, that will really increase your stability and your sustainability. And so the Kresge Challenge Grant was born probably 25 or 30 years ago. At the time, it was seen as sort of this audacious, almost intrusive way of getting institutions to raise money. And again, it's sort of hard to remember that because now, 20 or 30 years later, this is absolutely standard practice in the fundraising business of nonprofits. But for the better part of 30 years, Kresge would come in the middle of a campaign, put money on the table and say, if you match this, we'll free the money and you can get across the finish line faster and with a broader donor base.
We'll be the capstone to this capital campaign effort. So you arrive at Kresge in 2006, and you bring with you, Rip, a real interesting background and a breadth of experience. You worked in the public sector as a legislative aide to Congressman Fraser, were the deputy mayor in Minneapolis. You have private sector experience working as a lawyer and doing a lot of pro bono work, and of course, nonprofit experience having led the McKnight Foundation. So given this background, give us a sense of how you imagined some different possibilities for Kresge and then how you went about introducing them.
Well, it's such an interesting question, if I can peel it away just a little bit, Henry, because when I was first approached to talk to the Kresge Foundation, when they were looking for a new executive in 2005, 2006, I said to the search firm that I wasn't particularly interested. Kresge was such a familiar brand, I mean, as you suggested. It was challenge grants were all they did. They were the bricks and mortar folks. And in many ways, they had refined how to do this within an inch of its life. It was really almost an algorithm that you would construct a gift chart with a certain number at the top and a certain number in the middle and a certain number at the base, and you would sort of push the numbers through that frame. And if it came out the other side in a way that seemed to meet the standard, then we became an ATM machine and the money flowed.
And it was the same for every institution, no matter what the sector.
Every institution. So if you were the Harvard Medical School or a hospice in San Diego or an arts organization in San Diego, it didn't make any difference.
Same algorithm.
And there was something valuable to that in that it really helped refine and streamline a lot of fundraising operations in a lot of places. And it created hundreds and thousands of buildings that probably would have been built anyway, but might have been built a little faster, and in fact might have really helped the capacity of these organizations cultivate individual donors. So, long way of saying, I didn't think I would add much value to that. Matter of fact, in the first interview I had, one of the board members said, do you think we have too large or too small a staff? And I basically suggested to them that I thought that we had way too large a staff, that you really just needed a very high-speed computer and a couple of administrative people. A little bit less obnoxious than that, but to circle back. So I said to the search firm, I would be happy to talk to Kresge if they'd permit me to sort of stretch the argument just a little bit, talk a little bit about what I thought private philanthropy could do, perhaps ways in which this insistence on a single tool for a single purpose in all circumstances might be limiting their alternatives, thinking that it was just sort of a friendly critique. I mean, I didn't mean to be presumptuous or arrogant. I just thought they might enjoy having an alternative perspective. So I walked in, and we just had a ball because the trustees were intrigued by looking at the model a little bit differently. They also were deeply interested in trying to be more effective in Detroit, and we can talk more about that, but it turned into a much more extended conversation, both about what tools are available to philanthropy, what might their role be, how might that land in a place like Detroit where Kresge had very deep roots, because the Kresge family had remained throughout its evolution in Detroit and remains there today.
And also, Rip, when you arrived in Detroit in 2006, this was now a couple years before the Great Recession, it was a pretty happening place, wasn't it?
It was, again, hard to recall looking back, but Detroit had just elected its, what they call it, the hip-hop mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick. He was a 31-year-old, brilliant, charismatic, policy smart, gregarious, former lineman for Florida State University All-American. I mean, he was just this incredible package. I remember walking in for the very first time to meet Mayor Kilpatrick, and he was just all confidence and energy, and in some ways he reminds me a little bit of Bill Clinton. I mean, he had a photographic memory. He was great on policy. And just moved a mile a minute.
Right. And you were the only person in the room when you were speaking to him.
Oh, absolutely. Although you were a very little person in the room when you were speaking to him. Big presence in any number of ways. But Kilpatrick in 2006 and continuing until 2007 had really infused a sense of energy in Detroit, a sense of optimism. Here was this young, dynamic mayor with big plans. There were cranes everywhere. We had just opened the Riverwalk. We had turned our attention to downtown in a more serious way, and people really believed that Detroit had finally turned the corner. The autos seemed to be in reasonable shape, and the prognosis was good. And then any number of things happened in the next couple of years to demonstrate how shallow that really had been.
Yeah, it was sort of a harmonic convergence descended upon the city. The mayor goes to jail. The auto industry just doesn't go bankrupt. They are on their way to the graveyard for one last time, according to many. But in this scene, the philanthropic sector, led by Kresge, steps into a vacuum. Really quite extraordinary when you come to think about it. How did you proceed?
Mayor Kilpatrick had his political difficulties, his legal difficulties. That would have been one thing. But he brought with him an entire administration. There are now 50 or 60 members of his administration that are even either serving time or have served time. So it wasn't just the collapse of a particular individual, a charismatic person sort of falling from grace. It was a collapse of the entire sector.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And as you suggest, the entire auto sector, because Detroit at that point was such a sort of a command and control economy, the auto supply chain was on the brink every bit as much as General Motors and Chrysler. I mean, it was a precarious situation because nobody was home. I mean, the private sector was in the bunker, and the public sector was in jail, and so it became an interesting proposition for a place like Kresge with disposable and discretionary resources to say, is there some role we can play, not to step into the shoes of the public sector or the shoes of the private sector, because ultimately we can't really create jobs and we can't govern. But are there ways in which we can create civic scaffolding that will hold this community until we return to some sense of normalcy?
Interesting.
And so we chose 8 or 9 discrete bodies of activity where we felt that philanthropic dollars could actually hold something in place or create something new or accelerate something that seemed to be moving in the right direction, and hope that we could hold that pattern for 3 or 4 years or however long it took for the situation to right itself. And in retrospect, that is exactly what happened. We chose to invest in public transit, creating a light rail system, and that's something that the philanthropic and the private sectors don't usually get engaged in, but we did. We launched a expansive land use planning process, which is, again, something normally the public sector would do, but it really couldn't. It wasn't equipped to do that. We pumped an enormous amount of time and energy and thought into helping create a more robust arts and cultural ecology. We took a run at education reform. I mean, it really
Lots of things.
was sort of the broad spectrum of building blocks that any community needs in order just to stabilize, at least for a short while.
And the defining initiative of this effort was something called the Grand Bargain. What was the Grand Bargain?
Well, as we were busy building this scaffolding over the period really of about 2008 to 2013, as much progress as we were making, it was becoming clearer and clearer that on at least 2 fronts, the city's financial situation was untenable. On one hand, you had long-term debt that was just swamping the city. Retiree benefits, creditor claims against bonds that we had issued, all sorts of complexity. And every year there was a structural deficit in City Hall. We just were spending at a rate that was outpacing our revenues. And so the governor gave the city a number of chances to try to right its ship, and it just simply couldn't. It could not balance its books. It couldn't figure out any way to make a dent in these long-term liabilities. And so the governor declared a state of financial emergency and appointed an emergency manager, a guy named Kevin Orr, who would run the bankruptcy for Chrysler, brilliant lawyer from Jones Day, African-American guy who was able to come in to town and take a hard, long look at whether this was really a situation that could be moved forward in any reasonable way. He concluded that it could not.
Okay.
That as hard as the city might work and as hard as he might pull strings here and there around the edges, that we really needed to go into bankruptcy. So in 2013, Orr recommended and the governor agreed to declare a state of bankruptcy. The problem was this was a bankruptcy with no new assets. So how are you going to resolve creditor claims or long-term pension obligations or even the sort of the cost-revenue imbalance of the government without any new money? So the bankruptcy judge had appointed a mediator, and the mediator was a guy named Judge Rosen, a federal district court judge. And Judge Rosen got a brainstorm. He thought, well, what are the assets that the creditors are going to go after? It's likely to be some land, some parking garages, but ultimately not much. What they really are going to go after are the holdings of the Detroit Institute of Art, because the Detroit Institute of Arts is actually publicly owned, or was actually publicly owned in Detroit. And so there was an argument to be made that all of the Van Goghs and all of the Picassos in that collection were subject to sale, liquidation, and could be used to satisfy the creditors. Similarly, if you didn't do that, the pensioners were looking at deep, deep cuts, and these were not gilded pensions. The general pensioners were probably getting a $19,000 pension. The police and fire were probably getting a $30,000 pension. If we did nothing and brought no new money to the table, those pensions would probably be cut in half. So you're looking at a 74-year-old retiree living on $9,000 or $10,000 a year. It was just untenable. So Judge Rosen, to make, a very long story short, basically said, why don't we create a device where we pool enough capital to essentially buy the art from the city, put it into nonprofit hands, and we'll use the proceeds of that sale to buck up the pensioners' stability and make sure that they don't take a cut. And he called me. He and I were old doubles partners, tennis doubles partners 40 years earlier in Washington, D.C. And he called me for dinner, and he said, I want to get the foundations together and ask whether you guys would be willing to step forward and underwrite that kind of fund. And I said, well, it seems like a terrific idea. I mean, how much are you talking about? And he said, I don't know, $500, $600 billion, here or there. And I just laughed and I said, Judge, we'd love to be helpful, but I just don't think
Not that helpful.
That's going to happen. But he persisted, and I said, well, all right, if you do float this idea, it's important that you make it not about the art and not about the pensions, because foundations, I don't think, can be seen as stepping in for the public sector in underwriting pensions, nor can they be seen as saving the art at the expense of people. I mean, you could put that same money to work for jobs or technology or whatever. And so he came up with the construct, which ended up carrying the day, that this fund, which ended up being called the Grand Bargain, would be used to accelerate the resolution of the bankruptcy. And the argument is that you can't do any of the good that we had sought to do in the previous 5 or 6 years through the civic scaffolding if you were mired in bankruptcy for the next 10 years, litigating over whether the art was held in public trust or whether the pensions could be compromised. It would have just been a lawyer's field day.
Yeah, with the pensions, you got state constitutional law against bankruptcy law, and we could still be fighting that for all I know.
Yeah, we absolutely would be. And by putting together this fund, he was able to avoid that. So the fund is, to finally answer your question, the fund was $100 million of Kresge money, $125 million of Ford money, coupled with both national and local foundations. We were able to get that number up to almost $400 million.
Fantastic.
The state of Michigan then matched that number, and we got a contribution from the Institute of Art itself. And so we put together a fund that in total was almost $900 million, and that did prove sufficient to both purchase the art, transfer it to nonprofit ownership, and protect the pensioners against deep cuts.
And that was an extraordinary collaboration on the part of foundations. You certainly don't see that very often, but you were able to pull it off, and maybe because of the dire circumstances there, it became easier to bring them all together.
Although, could I say, Denver, one of the things that I think people often conclude after looking at the Grand Bargain is that there was this sort of momentous sort of lightning strike moment where we had no choice but to step in and help resolve the bankruptcy. And that was all true. My argument, though, is that that would not have been possible had we not had that previous 5 or 6 years of experience creating the scaffolding again. Sorry to keep using the word, but we had put together a fund among 10 foundations to promote small business development. We had had 6 or 7 foundations join us in our effort to create a more rational land use policy for the city. We had 6 or 7 of the national foundations join us in helping build out the light rail system, and the list goes on. And so by the time the Grand Bargain proposition was put to us, we had, I think, developed some muscle around collaboration. We had developed some trust. We could easily pick up the phone and try to convince ourselves that in many ways this wasn't so different from what we had done before.
That is an excellent point. I mean, you had built those relationships, and so often I think when you get into a crisis, you try to instantaneously create them, and you can't. You have to have laid the groundwork for it ahead of time. Well, there were so many great actors in this drama, and you've mentioned a couple with Jerry Rosen and Kevin Orr. Stephen Rhodes played a key role as well. But one key player from the private sector that really caught my imagination was Dan Gilbert of Quicken Loan, the CEO over there. Tell us what he has done for the city of Detroit.
It's hard on radio to convey how much of a grin is evoked by the name of Dan Gilbert, because he is such a force of nature in Detroit. In 2010 or so, Gilbert who had run Quicken Loans essentially, sold it, and then repurchased it. And he was kind of rebuilding the business. And he was located out in one of the suburbs of Detroit. And he thought, well, I've got a bunch of young people who are largely techies, and they'd much rather be in a downtown environment. So why don't I take my 1,500 employees and move them into downtown Detroit and make a statement? And so I think people thought that was a perfectly fine idea, and perhaps others might do the same, and over time they did. What we didn't know was the extent to which that was just the prelude to one of the most sort of extraordinary suite of activities I think I've ever watched in corporate America. as it relates to the sort of rebuilding of a city. Because not only did Gilbert move his 1,500 employees downtown, he sort of caught the curve just when it was billowing out. And his employee base grew and grew and grew. And then something happened that I think nobody expected. He began buying buildings downtown. And Detroit, for all of its struggles, has this incredible sort of physical architecture, sort of great bones.
Yeah, it does.
And so all of these buildings that had stood vacant for years and years and years were coming just at bargain sale prices. And so Gilbert began grabbing them up and filling them up with his expanding work base. And then he would go to some of his suppliers, whether it was a designer or an accountant or a PR firm, and say, it would really be terrific if you were part of our
I
campus.
bet it would
Why don't you come on down? He actually got Chrysler, for example, to move 70 of their PR people down for the first time. And lo and behold, within 3 or 4 or 5 years, right about the same time as the bankruptcy was really pushing up to the surface, Gilbert now owned 70, 80, 90 buildings. He now owns over 90 buildings, some, I don't know how you count it, 12, 13, 14 million square feet.
Right.
He has 15,000 employees downtown. And
Holy
he
cow.
has been able to attract Blue Cross Blue Shield and some of the other major employers of the region into downtown. And so what his influence in sort of revivifying, kind of giving life to the streets of downtown Detroit has just been stunning. And he has also sort of infused at least the central business district with a sense of young energy, because his employees tend to be very young. They're there for 4 or 5 or 6 years. He views his company less as a mortgage company and more as a tech company. He's become very involved in helping tech startups, so he has a whole series of spin-off operations that encourage young entrepreneurs to get going, and he's filled a couple of his buildings with those folks. And he's become, in some ways, sort of the symbol of what corporate America can do, sort of with this sort of double bottom line, doing well by doing good.
It works for him as well. Well, you're absolutely right. You can't overstate his contribution. It's extraordinary. You alluded before to this light rail system, and that was the brainchild of one Roger Penske of auto racing fame, and who really believed that there was a need for critical connective tissue to the whole greater Detroit area. But unfortunately, as is so often the case, other people's great ideas have you right in the middle of them, just like that. Tell us about it.
After I came to Kresge, I was asked by one of our trustees to have lunch with Roger Penske. And I didn't know Roger Penske. I came from Minneapolis. Minneapolis is not particularly a car culture or a racing culture. So this was just a respected business guy. But I had been told that Roger had spearheaded Detroit's effort to have the 2006 Super Bowl go well. And that wasn't a foregone conclusion. There was a lot of vacancy downtown. There was a lot of concern about crime. And there was a concern that the city really would not show well. And Penske moved in, spearheaded the effort, and by, I think, all accounts,
It came off great.
It came off great. The city looked good. It was clean. It was safe. And he actually translated a bunch of those initiatives into longer-term initiatives. He really is an icon in our community. So I went to a lunch not really fully comprehending this. And my board member said, well, so Rip, you're new. What advice would you offer Roger for what he should do next after the Super Bowl? And I said, well, I just drove down Woodward Avenue, our big honking main street that's like 8
lanes or something
wide.
like that, yeah.
It's wild. It's the first paved street in the United States. It's called M1, Michigan 1. Anyway, I said, it just seems so basic that you could run a public transit vehicle down that street without having to condemn buildings, without having to exert eminent domain, without having to do any of that. It just seems to me that you could do that fairly readily. And Roger kind of looked at me, I think not kind of knowing what that was about, and didn't say too much. But over the next number of months, it turns out that he took it very seriously, and he worked with a number of key folks to sort of build out the engineering construct, see whether that might be possible, and he concluded that it was. And so he, many months later, called a meeting of about a couple dozen corporate leaders and asked me to come and said, we've done the engineering, seems to work. I think we actually can build light rail between the river all the way up to 8 Mile, a full 8 mile stretch, which could then become sort of the backbone for a larger regional system. And we think it's going to cost only about $100 million. And I smiled, and I thought that was terrific.
Yeah.
And he looked to me and he said, and we need the first $35 million from you.
Not so terrific.
Well, it was one of those sort of executives' existential moments because sitting in a group of people who want to be supportive, who have done a ton of work, sort of executing an idea that was yours in some ways. And so a little tough to say no, but knowing that I had a board of directors who might not be so crazy about a philanthropy building a streetcar system.
It's a bit unusual.
But I said yes. I said yes. And Roger...
Deal with the board later.
Yeah. So anyway, make a complicated story short. Roger basically said, look, if you do the $35 million, I'll sell the naming rights. We'll find the rest of the budget, and we'll also figure out a way to lease cars because I'm good with moving stock. And so it all came together. But it has been, over the last decade, one of the most complicated,
I bet it has,
controversial, unorthodox projects that you can imagine. But the first cars just rolled into town. They're testing them out, and we hope to open the line next year.
Fantastic. Let me ask you an overarching question about all of this, and that is, how unique is this Detroit experience to where the role of the foundation has moved from philanthropy and education and advocacy to really playing a critical role in policy? I know some people don't think it is an appropriate role of philanthropy, but I'd be curious as to whether you think this is a one-off or perhaps a precursor to the changing role of philanthropy and that of the foundation CEO.
I'm asked a lot to come talk around the country about Detroit, and the temptation is always just to sort of lay out the Detroit story because it's sort of inherently interesting. But what I've found is that when you do that, people essentially raise exactly the question you've asked, which is, that's fine, but isn't this really so unusual that we really have to put it on the shelf? And it's sort of interesting color commentary, but it doesn't really have much to do with
Not transferable.
Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Charleston, West Virginia, or any number of other places. So what I've tried to do is the second part of your question, is I've tried to suggest that what has happened in Detroit over the last decade is the playing out of a series of roles on the part of philanthropy that perhaps aren't so unusual. That there are 5 or 6 ways in which philanthropy actually can sort of create an environment for investment that can be played in many communities across the country. And it doesn't always have to be philanthropy. It could be a United Way. It could be a strong business consortium.
What are some of those roles?
Well, for example, I think because philanthropy has this enormous privilege of being able to take a longer view, it can ask the harder questions. And so, for example, when Detroit was really struggling with land use, with all of this blight, we have 70,000 blighted parcels and these vast swaths of land that look like Dresden after World War II, it was imperative that we figure out how to convert those unproductive parcels into more productive uses. You just can't sustain a community with that level of disinvestment and abandonment. It was almost impossible for the public sector to have that conversation. It was really almost a political third rail because it immediately implicated, are you going to move me from my neighborhood?
Right.
Are you going to condemn me? What are you going to do? Where will I go? Where will the jobs be? On and on and on. And so I think philanthropy, in particular Kresge, felt that we sort of had a table-setting role, that we could introduce a conversation, sort of frame it up, bring in the resources we needed to have the conversation in a meaningful way. And that's exactly what we did for the better part of 2 or 3 years. We had this extraordinary blending of high-level technical experts coming in and sort of taking apart the land use possibilities, and combined that with one of the most robust citizen engagement processes any city has ever seen. And then this interesting creative tension zone in the middle when technical experts meet community wisdom, and that was interesting. But at the end of the day, we were able to formulate something called the Detroit Future City Plan, which is the sort of investment framework for the city. I think that's a good example of trying to find places where the community conversation or the community temperature generally makes it very difficult for either the private or the public sector to enter.
And I know now that you're the chair of Living Cities, which is just a wonderful organization. You are really able to take some of these learned lessons and try to transport them to other cities around the country.
Yes. Kresge just convened in Los Angeles, of all places, something called Drawing on Detroit, where we tried to gather 16 or 18 communities from across the country who were interested in one part or another of what had happened in Detroit. Some people were interested in how we had promoted small business development. Others were interested in land use. Others were interested in arts and culture. Others were interested in innovative financing mechanisms to promote mixed-use housing and commercial development. And what we essentially did was then flipped the script. We said, which of these ideas is of interest to you and what are the resources you need in order to execute on them. And so we've done a little mini grant program back into these 17 communities. And they've all come up with really interesting ways of customizing the work to their purpose. I mean, you can't just take the Detroit experience and plop it down in the middle of Columbus, Ohio.
Right.
But there are ways in which sort of the broad animating principles, I think, have application. So it sort of ties together both of your questions. I think on one hand, there are lots of ways of thinking about how philanthropy can be a catalyst, serve as glue, promote innovation, take risks. I mean, a whole suite of things. In ways that vary from place to place, but that are remarkably constant in sort of their broad arc of aspiration.
And another recent initiative of yours is something called Reimagine the Civic Commons. And I know you're doing this in partnership with a number of other foundations, and you're doing it in 4 cities, Chicago and Detroit, as well as Akron and Memphis. What does this reimagination look like?
The premise is that we have in almost every major city's midst a set of assets that are underutilized and that are often not fully accessible to low-income populations for any number of reasons. It may be the geography, it may be cost, it may be patterns of use, it may be any number of things. But when you stitch together libraries and swimming pools and parks and other sort of democratic spaces, the premise is that we ought to be able to figure out a way first to stitch those together more. There ought to be better connective tissue among them. Just moving around, getting from one place to another ought to be interesting. You could almost create sort of sub-districts. And second, we ought to be able to figure out how to program more effectively to make these places more inviting so that people will feel that, in fact, these are genuinely democratic institutions of municipal government. So we're going to sort of see what this looks like. And the good news is that in Philadelphia, they've sort of taken this concept way beyond where we probably could have taken it. And the mayor has just gotten the voters to agree to a big new bond issue that will impart, well, it's the tax on sweet drinks.
Sweet drinks, yeah.
To essentially underwrite the cost of renovation and reprogramming a lot of these civic assets, like libraries, like public parks.
Let me move on to another aspect of this. And you have said, Rip, that one cannot understand what has happened in Detroit without understanding how critical the arts and culture communities were to the reimaginative use of these blighted and these abandoned properties. Tell us about that and give us a couple of examples if you could.
It's so tempting, I think, Denver, to think about arts as something that sort of exists on the margins. We'll get to the art museum when we have time. We'll sort of endure the idiosyncrasies of these performing artists on the street. The premise in Detroit has been, and I think it's increasingly a premise shared by other communities, is that arts can actually be central to helping the revitalization and the reimagination of disinvested places. We've used a term called creative placemaking, which is probably too fancy, but essentially is using acts of creativity to a reimagined place. And when you think about the reclamation of an abandoned house and turning it into a performance space, when you think about merging urban gardening with youth employment, with sort of youth mural projects. I mean, there are endless ways in which arts and culture can help animate space, can help give community a different sense of voice. And fundamentally, I would argue that if you can increasingly push that kind of creativity into the public decision-making process, you get better decisions. That there's a sort of a quality of innovation and entrepreneurship and out-of-the-box thinking that helps you sort of deconstruct problems and put them back in a different way. And in a place like Detroit, where we have gotten really stale in how we do our problem solving, we've been doing it the same way for a very long time, it hasn't worked very well, the opportunity for arts to get into the mix and actually sort of push and prod and cause sort of a different chemistry to occur, I think is a really powerful thing. And there are just endless examples in a place like Detroit, or actually in virtually any community, I would argue, that you look at, whether it is Detroit or even a strong market city, where Boston or New York, where the arts have sort of redefined what it means to engage with a place.
I think a great example of that in Detroit is the Flower House. Tell us about that.
The Flower House was an idea hatched by a couple of artists who thought, why don't we take a house that is going to be torn down anyway and contact the 50 greatest visual artists in the world that we can think of who are capable of working with flowers and give them this sort of canvas to work on. And so they brought in, I think the number was 30 different artists from all across the world, and each was given a hallway or a room or a roof garden or something to program. And it was just this sort of glorious sort of reimagination of this very blighted, rundown place. It stood up for, I think, a couple of weeks while the flowers stayed fresh. And they gathered, I can't remember, thousands and thousands of people walked through, mostly from the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Folks, mostly
it's
from the
a
neighborhood.
wild place. I've seen it. It's just remarkable.
It's remarkable. And when the flowers sort of had led their useful life, they didn't try to kind of keep it going. They kind of let it fall apart. They knew the house was going to be demolished anyway, and they took the vacant lot and they've repurposed it to a flower garden. And so it's now an ongoing garden that sells flowers to local markets.
Yeah, I've read a lot about the Detroit experience, and I must say myself that I always thought that arts were nice to have. I mean, really very, very nice to have. But in looking at what's happened in Detroit, I really have a new appreciation as to how essential they are. You really do have to have them. They really do become part of the fabric of the community, just like housing and security and all those other things that we need. And I know that you and Kresge deeply believe that.
We certainly do. And I think the only gloss I would add to that is that they are also small businesses, remember?
Yeah.
This is an opportunity for people to come in and get a foothold. And what we've seen is that a lot of the artists who have come to Detroit don't make a ton of money, but they do make a living. And they're able to, one way or another, figure out how to translate art into economic activity. Detroit has a great avenue called the Avenue of Fashion. It used to be where the African-American middle class got all of its clothes and materials for any number of things. And it, like so many places in Detroit, has fallen into disuse and disinvestment over the last 20, 30 years. And one of the things that occurred early on in my tenure was the creation of a program called Revolve, in which we used sort of pop-up arts to sort of reinvigorate the avenue, just to demonstrate that you could do sort of creative things with these old abandoned storefronts. And it started just with a couple of small pop-ups and slowly expanded into a much more elaborate program that ended up becoming something called Motor City Match, which is a major initiative of the Duggan administration, Mayor Duggan's administration, to locate small businesses and provide them with capital and space and technical assistance to sort of repopulate this avenue. And now Livernois Avenue, the Avenue of Fashion, is giving some signs of sort of returning to what it once was, which is this hub of community activity and pride and economic energy.
That's spectacular. How are the arts faring, Rip, in this sort of data-driven culture we have in philanthropy now? Evidence that the investment in arts and culture is getting the ROI that funders and others want. I mean, is it hard to measure? And is there an expectation that it will be measured?
It is hard to measure. And I think sometimes those things that we can't measure are not always the most important things to measure, and vice versa. I think some of the extraordinarily valuable things just are very difficult. I think at some level you do want to try to track whether arts organizations, arts activities, at the end of the day can be sustained. After putting a lot of subsidy into a program, does it really spit out the kind of returns that you want? I think we just can't avoid that kind of analysis. But at the end of the day, I think there is sort of a softer, sort of more qualitative quality to what the arts lend to community, which is the sort of sense of community vibrancy, the sense of community engagement, the sense of community identity. And those are really tough things to quantify. It doesn't mean you can't measure them. I think you perhaps just measure them somewhat differently. I think you tell stories about them.
The narrative.
I think you get people together who can share experiences. I think you have folks try to inspire young people with example. I mean, I think these can be proof points, which is not exactly the same as sort of quantitative measurement.
Let me get back to your organization for a minute, if I may. How difficult was it for you to change the corporate culture at Kresge? And for all I know, Rip, you still may be changing it. It was a revered institution. It had a very clear brand, as we discussed. And it's never easy to get board members and staff, particularly those who've been around for quite a while, to go along with this transformational change. How difficult was it, and how did you go about doing it?
I would be less than candid if I didn't admit that it was very difficult. The Kresge that I walked into in 2006 had a very clear brand.
It sure did.
As a matter of fact, the first annual report I did when we had sort of hard copy annual reports was a brick. I thought everyone would know that came from Kresge, right? Because that is what we did. And when I came, it wasn't my intention to necessarily deconstruct what Kresge did. I thought we could make it more responsive. I thought we could get into the campaigns a little bit earlier. I thought we might diversify the kinds of organizations we supported, because one of the things that happened with the Kresge Challenge Grant is that larger organizations became increasingly sophisticated about how to essentially game our system, how to sort of fill out the gift charts, how to make sure that their campaign would work, often staffed by large development staffs. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it sort of meant that a lot of the smaller organizations just couldn't compete. They just couldn't assemble that kind of sophistication. So my initial assumption was that we would sort of tinker around the edge and try to make it a little bit more responsive. But I actually asked the board if I might take 6 months, even before I began, to go around the country and sort of canvass folks about how they believed the field of fundraising, the field of philanthropy had changed, and where Kresge's place was in all of that. And what became really clear was that the field of fundraising had really caught up with Kresge. I mean, all of a sudden, Kresge's $1 million gift to build a new lecture hall was being dwarfed by a $25 million gift from an individual.
That's right.
Or $5 million gifts. And we were just a box to check off. We were no longer sort of the driving, precipitating factor in the success of a building campaign. So that was one piece of information. The second was, and you asked earlier about this, was I think an attitude that philanthropy could play a more proactive role in taking on some of the defining issues of our time. When you think about building campaigns, buildings are important. They can be life and death. If you're trying to revitalize an icon like the Statue of Liberty, there is nothing more important. But so often, you might be just simply adding to an arms race of a new dormitory or a new wing of a hospital that may or may not be directly responsive to what a community's highest and most pressing needs are. So I encouraged our trustees and our staff to think more broadly and say, if we have always funded in the arts, we funded in education, we funded in healthcare, we funded in human services, is our money going to the highest and best sort of niche of where we can make a difference? Or could we at least step back and consider the possibility that there are other uses for our money? And that took a very long time. But the response back from both the board and from our staff was probably yes, that we can increasingly sort of seed the ground to other individual donors and institutional donors to do the building work, but perhaps the programming for the buildings or perhaps the programming in community could become elevated. And so I adopted a simple concept of sort of depreciating the asset. So each year we would sort of take a look at our capital challenge and understand how much of that continued to have value and how much could we sort of strip away and replace with something that looked a little bit different and performed a little bit differently. And by, I would say, year 6 or so, we had completely flipped the proportion. When I came, we were doing 99% capital challenge grants. Yeah. 6 years later, we were perhaps doing 1% capital challenge grants.
Listening to you and listening to some of your counterparts who've been on the show, you all make a real powerful case how these disciplines must be interbraided to achieve system change and optimal impact. Things like, artists getting involved in creative problem solving and working with the engineers who are putting the new transit system in. But when I look at foundations, they still list their 5 to 7 program areas. So I want to ask you, do you see this changing where the way you describe your programs, the way you describe what you do, is more reflective of how you're helping these communities in a holistic way on the ground?
Well, your previous question was about culture change, and in many ways this is a sort of a continuation of that question, because you're absolutely right. I mean, if version 1.0 of Kresge was our capital challenge grants, version 2.0 was the development of these discrete bodies of focus, human services, education, where we were trying to aim at a slightly higher objective. I would argue that version 3.0 is exactly what you've suggested, which is to understand the interconnection among those systems. But boy, oh boy, is that hard. Not only do you have sort of the received tradition of 50 years of philanthropy sort of organizing itself this way, but it's just sort of innately difficult for subject matter experts to sort of cast a little 18 degrees to their right to figure out how a health issue is defined slightly differently by an environmental issue. And one of the ways we've tried to break into that mindset is by focusing on place. And so in our work in Detroit, it's actually a very straightforward proposition. You can't think about transit without thinking about education, without thinking about the location of your anchor institutions. You can't think about those without thinking about your workforce. I mean, all of the systems are just completely bumping into each other and ricocheting around. And so what we've said is, why don't we take a number of the places in which we have more than one grant type, so Memphis, New Orleans, Oakland, and understand how our health grant, for example, could or should somehow be connected to our environment grant or to our community development grant or to our human services grant. And so we will sort of follow one of our teams into a place, but then ask all of the teams to at least ask the question of whether there isn't some relationship of one to the other. And this became most clear to me when I took a trip 3 or 4 years ago down to New Orleans, and we gathered all of our grantees from New Orleans around the table, and there was an environmental grantee and a health grantee and a human services grantee and an education grantee. None of them had ever met each other. None of them had ever spoken with each other, and certainly our program staff hadn't met the acquaintances of the others. And I came back and I said, why don't we essentially use New Orleans as well as a couple of other places and see what it would look like to have these things be mutually informing. Again, it may be that we just invest side by side, that there's no true interbreeding, but it's also possible that increasingly we might pursue investments that are sort of jointly developed. And that's what we found, is that our environment team is increasingly talking with the health team about environmental health. I mean, you can't talk about the threats of climate change and rising water in New Orleans without thinking about it as a health proposition or as a workforce training proposition. So I think it's hard to do in the abstract. I think our colleagues who have national programs find it very difficult to braid these programs together. My way of trying to bust that up just a little bit is to try to do it in a place-based way, and then maybe you can build out from there.
Well, it's always hard to do these things when people are involved, but it sounds like you're on your way. Let me close with this, and perhaps this will neatly sum up much of what we discussed this evening. For someone out there listening who decides to visit Detroit today, how different would it be from them taking that very same trip 5 years ago?
It is like walking to a different planet. When I came 10 years ago, nobody was on the street after 6 o'clock in downtown or our midtown areas. Our riverfront was essentially just beginning to come back to life as the front porch of the community. It was hard coming from a place that, as I did, Minneapolis, where there was a lot of street life, a lot of vitality. But I think more than anything, I think what you would see now 5 years later, in addition to street life and kids and grown-ups on the street doing all sorts of activities, is that the sort of the intangible of a sense of optimism. I think 5 and 10 years ago, people really weren't sure that the narrative was wrong, that Detroit was such a difficult place, struggling with such sort of deep, profound racial division, issues of illiteracy, joblessness, youth disengagement. I mean, the list was just on. It was really, in many ways, the poster child for urban failure.
Yeah.
And I think now there is a very different sense of the possible. And I'm sorry to be hokey or sound like the chamber, but I mean, when you talk to a young entrepreneur, they have chosen to come to Detroit rather than New York because they actually think they can make a difference. It's a community of a scale that is not unmanageable. It is a community that is beginning to develop new musculature around taking risk and starting something new and forming a different sense of community. And yet it is a community with this extraordinary rich heritage. I mean, when you think about the sort of the cultural power of a place like Detroit, when I go abroad and I mention Detroit, everybody knows Detroit. And it's not just because of the autos. It could be Motown. It could be the black middle class moving in sort of the mid-20th century. I mean, there are just so many qualities of this place that I think make it unlike a lot of American cities. And so it's unlike a lot of American cities, but it's also sort of the emblematic American city. And so I think what I would say is that the possibility of returning this emblematic city to a position of greatness and sustainability and health and vitality is no longer seen as an impossibility. It's seen as not only a possibility, it's seen as an imperative. And I think that's an energizing place for a community to be.
And it owes a lot to Kresge Foundation for all of that. For people to learn more about Kresge and what you're doing in cities and your other programs, your website would be?
Kresge.org.
There you go. Well, Rip Rapson, the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, thanks so much for a wonderful conversation. You know, I was just thinking the other day, in this age where people are glamorizing failure, don't be afraid to fail. I won't invest in an entrepreneur unless they fail 2 or 3 times. They wear failure like a badge of honor in Silicon Valley. I think what you said about it is still the most refreshing and sensible thing that I've heard yet, which is when you're going to fail, try not to. It was a real pleasure to have you on the program, Rip.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
The Business of Giving can be heard every Sunday evening between 6 and 7 p.m. Eastern on AM 970 The Answer in New York and on iHeartRadio. You can follow us at Biz of Give on Twitter and at Facebook.com/business.